Should you rent or own your own home? Hi, I'm Phil Pustiowski with FreedomMentor.com. I'm a full-time real estate investor, real estate mentor to investors all across this country and Canada. I'm also a real estate agent, and I have been a part of a tremendous amount of real estate transactions over the years, both buying homes from people that need to get rid of their property, as well as helping out friends, family, and other acquaintances with their properties. I have been involved in this business my entire adult career, my entire adult life. So I've had the privilege of having to field questions related to real estate for basically every day of my life, including on Sundays when people ask me questions at church. So I've been bombarded for the past decade with questions, and therefore I have a unique perspective. And so this video, I think, will be very unique as it pertains to this subject matter. Because there are certainly some simple calculators online that will show you the option of, is it better to rent versus own? There's so much more to this subject than just a simple calculator. It's like an onion. There are layers that have to be peeled back. So hopefully I can be efficient in this video, but it's definitely going to get in depth. Now, where this all got started was, I recently did a video on personal finance wisdom. And in there, in passing, I kind of quickly dropped in that for many people, it's actually a better deal financially to rent their own home as opposed to own it. And that created quite a controversy in the comments section. In some side, they had some people thinking that I was absolutely crazy. Other people were calling me a genius. So it depended on the person's perspective. And in those comments, I didn't have enough room to really explore this topic like I can here. Okay, so let's start with why I believe that for most people, renting is a better deal than owning. But then I'm going to go through a lot of other angles and different things that you need to consider in your own situation. Okay, so we're going to do a little chart here of rent and own. By the way, it's probably pretty unique for a real estate agent like myself who sells properties to people that I fix up and resell and those kinds of things, that I'm so pro-rental, but it's because of all my years in this business. I've seen what happens, and that's what I want to talk about here. Here's the thing we need to first consider when it comes to rental. It's a fixed cost. Assuming your rental is set up as a normal standard lease, you know what your monthly payment is going to be every month. Whereas when you own, this is a variable expense. You have no idea what could come up tomorrow that you may have to pay for. I'll give you an example. I went on a family vacation. I came back, and the air conditioner, the little drip pan that drips the water, we have two different air handling units in this property. One is upstairs, one is down. And so the one upstairs, that drip pan got clogged, and water seeped out and it leaked. It became a $2,000 expense to fix the whole darn thing. Poof, $2,000. And if you're a homeowner, you know what I'm talking about. It's like a bottomless pit. There's always something going wrong, right? That's part of home ownership. Well, what happens is when you're renting, you don't have to concern yourself with that. The landlord does. Now, the landlord may not always fix up what needs to be fixed up, but the burden is typically on them. So first, you've got the variable expense, and that ends up being pretty darn huge. All right, number two, this is a hidden one. I'm just going to say no improvements. When you rent a home, you tend not to want to go improve it because you don't own it. So you're not tempted to repaint, to put in new floor coverings, to put on an addition. When you own a home, you want to fix it up. So all of a sudden, you take out home equity lines of credit to rebuild the deck, and you do all sorts of things. Home Depot and Lowe's do really well as retailers because as homeowners, there's a temptation to want to fix it up. Whereas when you're renting, there's no temptation there. So right here, we're already starting to see the savings, but there's more to it. Now, this is where things get interesting. In most cases, if you're in a certain price point, and that usually is a nicer home in a nicer area, either medium to median upper, nicer parts, typically this is lower total cost than owning. And so often I hear the lament, well, no, Phil, because the landlord passes on the expense to the tenant. So the rental rate is higher to cover those expenses. I have discovered that's not usually true. Now, certain areas are different. But in a lot of situations, the landlords that you are renting from, if you're a decent home in a decent area, they're not a professional investor. They're an investor by default. Maybe they moved out of that home to buy a new home and they couldn't sell it, or they were too greedy to drop the price low enough, so they rented just because they have no other option. Maybe they inherited the property and they're leasing it out. I have found, again, working with friends, family, other clients over all these years, so often I have found that the rental rate here would be $1,200, but when I look at the value of the property as well as the cost of taxes, insurance, HOA, this thing ends up having a monthly payment of, say, like $1,400 when it's all said and done. So, I know that may sound counterintuitive, but so often I see where the landlord either A, is losing a little bit of money each month, or B, they have a low enough loan so that their monthly payment may only end up being, say, $1,100. I'll put a 1 there. It's only $1,100 because they have a low mortgage. But if you came in and bought it, you'd have to come in and probably, you may not have a humongous down payment, so therefore your payment would be higher. Does that make sense? I hope I didn't totally confuse you there. All right, the next one is a low down payment. You do have to have a first month's rent, maybe first and last month's rent. Here you're going to have a significant down payment. And even in today's world of creative loans, there's always at least a 10%. Sometimes with FHA it's 3.5%, but still that can be a substantial amount of money, okay, depending on the size of the property. So this typically has a lower amount down, and so not only are you saving money without having to put the money as a down payment, but your total cost usually ends up being lower on a monthly basis. Almost always. It's pretty wild. I mean, again, some situations are a little bit different where it's a higher cost to rent than it is your total cost to own, but you can run that math on your own. And that's just one of the spots too. You got to keep the fix up and variable costs in mind as well as you start to look at that, as well as the significant down payment. Okay, so another big thing I want you to keep in mind is no commitments here. Now you may be saying, well, wait a minute, you're signing a lease, you have a 1-year commitment. True, but I have been a landlord for a very long time, and if a tenant moves out of a property, they're gone. It's very hard to sue them to get the rest of the rent money. Now, in commercial real estate, you can do that. In residential, they move out of the property, they're out. And that landlord can try to sue them for the money that's lost because they just bailed prior to the end of the lease, but it's hard to get that money. This is a huge commitment. Huge commitment. If you get a mortgage and you own the property, you've got a big commitment on your hands. I've used this phrase for so many years, and it's very, very true in a lot of cases. Buying a home is kind of like going to jail. It can be real easy to get in, but it can be really difficult to get out. So when you own a home and you try to get out of it, you have to sell it, okay? Or you can lease it back out. But either way, you've got to do something to get yourself out of there and cover payments. And the easiest way being to sell it. Problem is, selling your home is not always easy, and this is a very important point right here. There are transactional costs for buying and selling a home. These transactional costs end up really adding up. But someone put here, no. There's no transactional costs here. No trans costs. So let's talk about what these transactional costs are. Number one, when you buy the property, there are going to be closing costs above and beyond the purchase price. Now, you sometimes can get the seller to pay for them, but let's just use the amount 2%. When you buy a property, your closing costs tend to be a little bit higher than when you sell. So let's say 2% when you try to buy. That's an extra cost just for you getting the privilege to buy it. It usually comes in the form of recording taxes from the county, title insurance, and all sorts of other fun stuff. If you've ever seen a settlement statement, you know what I'm talking about. Then when you go to sell, typically people use a full-service listing. Now, if you really know what you're doing, you can do a flat fee listing. Either way, you're still going to be at least 3%, but for most people, they're going to be at 6% in sales costs when they go to sell it. Now, when you go to sell it, you also have, you're going to have some closing costs. We'll call that 1%. And you may even have to do a little bit of fix-up because they do an inspection. They may find some problems with it. Let's call it another 1%. So together here, these transactional costs are 10%. Here's why that's so critical. When you buy a property, if you want to get out of that thing after a year, let's say you bought it and you realized it was a bad area of town, a train drives by every 14 minutes that you didn't know about, you hate your neighbors, all kinds of reasons you want to move out. Your property has to sell for 10% more than what you paid for it just to break even. Oh, did you ever think about that? 10%. That's a huge number. So one of the big keys of being a homeowner is that you have to live in that property long enough so that hopefully this thing goes up by 10%. Did you know that over the past 100 years, Robert Shiller, who is an economist at Yale, he has proven that single-family homes do not appreciate, but they literally keep pace with inflation, which ends up being about like 2.8, call it 3%. So typically houses go up by about 3% a year, but they're not going up in appreciation. That's just the fact that your dollar bill is losing value. It's called inflation. So they're going up, and you probably asked the question, well, why are they going up to keep in pace with inflation? Well, that's because the cost of a builder having to pay for the employees, the materials to build the actual property, the land itself is not actually typically going up either. So it's really, this really comes down to material and labor costs that go up over time, and that's how it gets in. Don't get too confused on that. Point is, when you look at the number 3% and you look at the number 10%, you need to be in that property a minimum of 4 years just to break even or get a little bit of potential benefit from being a homeowner. Interesting, huh? Now, you might be saying, well, wait a minute, Phil, you're forgetting about two key items of being a homeowner. Number one would be, and hopefully you've got some room here, so I'm just going to put 10% next to transactional costs because I need some more room. This could be a benefit here. First of all, you can get debt pay down. Debt pay down. Meaning a portion of your mortgage payment actually goes toward the principal of the loan. Have you ever seen on a statement how much goes toward the principal in the first couple years? Very little. I mean, let's, maybe $100 a month. Okay? I mean, very, very little goes toward the debt pay down in the first couple of years. And now, as the years progress, all of a sudden that gets a little bit better. And again, we're starting to build up to where it's valuable to be a homeowner versus to rent. And we're getting there, as you can tell. So debt pay down is there. It exists. It's not bad. It beats a poke in the eye. Next thing is interest tax deduction. Now, this is interesting. In the United States, not in Canada and other countries, but in the United States, the interest on your mortgage is tax deductible, meaning it reduces your overall income that you have to pay taxes on. Now, that can be very beneficial, but not for everybody. In fact, in many cases, the standard deduction the IRS gives outstrips or is better than if you did an itemized deduction and you included interest tax deduction. Interesting, isn't it? So on the surface, you're like, oh man, tax deduction for the interest. And since, as we talked about, it's mostly all interest, not debt pay down, so maybe this ends up being like $700 a month you're paying or more in interest, so that can be a pretty good tax deduction, right? Sure, but your standard deduction's probably bigger than that for most people. Again, you talk to your accountant. At some point, when you're making a ton of money and you've got a really, really expensive house with huge interest, then maybe that's different, right? But for most cases, you are probably going to use your standard deduction on your taxes, not itemized, and this would fall in the itemization. Interesting, right? So for these reasons, I feel like it's almost always a better idea for people to rent. Now, what I talked about was this idea that short term it's better to go rental, and then I've mentioned this idea of long term it may be better to own. So one thing I want to point out is this. Mortgages in home ownership. Statistics show that people tend to stay in their mortgage for 3 years, and the average person stays in their home for 5 years. So watch this. We talked about how you have to be in your property for almost 4 years just to break even because of all the transactional costs, okay? Well, the average person lives in their home for 5 years. So the average person is moving, changing jobs, transferring within 5 years anyways. But even crazier is they refinance within 3 years. So their debt pay down starts all over again. So they always stay in this realm of a very low pay down and high interest on their mortgage as far as the breakdown of the payment. And since the standard deduction kind of cancels this thing out, this thing's of almost no value. So if you are going to be a homeowner, here's what you want to keep in mind. Number one, if you are going to own your own home, you need to think in terms of long term. Long term. That is so critical here. Now, the benefit of owning is permanence. Permanence. Because guess what a huge issue with renting is? Uncertainty. What happens if that landlord decides they're going to sell the property? They're tired of losing money, $200 a month for the last 5 years. They want to sell the property. So you have some uncertainty as a tenant that that landlord might stop making mortgage payments. They may just want to sell the house at the end of the lease. So there is some uncertainty. You get permanence when you own. But you have to be looking at this from a long-term perspective. Because if you don't live there at least 4 years, you probably won't even break even with what you paid for it from an expense standpoint. You won't even just cover your bases. So you have to be in there, and that's why we say, 5 years. Let's just use round numbers. 5 years where you need to stay in that thing at minimum. Now, here's another big thing that rentals can't give you, is you can get instant equity. If you're a real estate investor and you watch my videos, you may know how to go about the process of potentially buying a property lower than what its existing value is at the moment at which you buy it. That is really key. If you know what you're doing, you can do this. Now, it sounds good on the surface, but here's what I've discovered all my years and working with friends and family and everybody else that says, Phil, I want to buy a home and I want to get a great deal on it. They have discovered the best deals make for lousy homes. They tend to not have the right number of bedrooms, they don't have the right layout, they don't have the right this, the right that. And so what happens is, if you're trying to buy a home and you have a spouse involved in the decision, I have found over the years it's so hard for people to buy homes with instant equity because the instant equity deals tend to not be the ones they want to live in. For all kinds of reasons. Again, it just comes from experience. This isn't theoretical. I've watched this happen. So what ends up happening is the people look for a great deal, they find some great deals, but they don't fit what they're looking for, and they end up going to the MLS, and they end up buying a retail home, they end up buying a brand new home, they just kind of throw their hands up in the air and buy the home they want. And they end up paying full retail value. And so this is kind of a myth, in other words. Now, yours truly, I did this. So you're probably wondering, well, what's my personal situation? Well, my wife wanted permanence. She did not want uncertainty. I wanted to rent. Let me just assure you, I wanted to rent. She wanted to own. Now, we decided to pick an area that we wanted to live, and we knew we'd be there for the long term. And also, I was absolutely adamant that we would get a tremendous amount of instant equity or we were not going to buy. And that was the bottom line. And so it took 2.5 years for me to find the home that I live in. So I ask you the question, do you have the kind of patience to look for the right home for 2.5 years? Maybe not. That's how long it took me to find a home with great instant equity that my wife actually liked. Had the pool, it had the, it was on the water, it had all the things that she wanted, right? 2.5 years for me to find it. So, if you can have the long-term perspective, you can get instant equity, you have the luxury of permanence. Now there's another thing that's really cool about home ownership, and it only happens in a few states, one of which is Florida, the other of which is Texas, and I think there's a few others. Homestead. What's homestead? Well, when Florida was first becoming a state, as well as Texas, they were trying to encourage people to move there. So they put this law in place that said if you own a home, if you get in trouble criminally, you have anything happens to you, the one thing that nobody can take away from you is your home. And they called it homesteading. So you get the power of ownership without ever having to concern yourself with potential loss. Assuming you don't have a bunch of debts that you have to pay off, like in a bankruptcy, that kind of thing. Or you could just tell the bankruptcy court, I'm not putting them in there because it's homesteaded. So what happens is you have these potential criminals and other people like O.J. Simpson. They moved to Florida and they bought these huge estates right before he got in real big trouble legally. Why? Because he put this property into homestead, which you have to live in the home, and it's not always easy to get this designation. You've got to do a couple of things right. But there's some power there. So one benefit is if you owned a home and you paid all cash for it, it's kind of a cool place to stick some money because if it's homesteaded, it's kind of a secure place. I'm not giving you legal advice there, but it's pretty powerful stuff right there. Now, one thing you can also do is when you own a home, you can get a HELOC. You can get a HELOC. What's that? It's a home equity line of credit. So let's say, for example, you own the home outright, or you have a ton of equity, you bought it with a ton of instant equity. You can instantly create a home equity line of credit, and then you can do deals with that money. And here's the cool thing about that HELOC. It's tax deductible. So if you aren't getting your standard deduction, but you are itemizing your deductions on your taxes, you can use the HELOC interest that you pay, and that's tax deductible. That's pretty sweet. I can assure you, I use a HELOC to do some of my deals, and I get the interest deduction. It's really sweet. So if you're in Florida or Texas and maybe a couple other states, you can get homestead. If you've got some equity, you can do a HELOC, which can be really helpful in doing other deals, parlaying that money into other either investments. I'm a real estate investor, so buying investments and those such things. It does give you this permanence, and it goes back to this rule, you've got to do it long term. Now, there's a couple other little caveats too. I've sometimes gotten the response, well, Phil, with renting, you have to have good credit. You've got to have you've got to have a job, those sorts of things. Well, I think in most cases that's true. You can, if you put out enough applications, you'd be surprised. Sometimes you can get hooked up with a decent situation, even if you don't have good credit or your job is kind of unstable. But with owning, you could do a creative transaction, right? You could talk to a motivated seller. And if you've watched my videos, you could potentially structure a creative deal. That is absolutely true. You can definitely do that. Very few people pull it off, and I go back to this concept of the best deals tend to be the lousy homes you don't want to live in. And if you have to please a spouse, a significant other, that's obviously the most difficult. If you are on your own, you're probably able to live in filth or just a property that's not all that perfect, and then you can fix it up along the way. You can put your own sweat equity into it. You can do all those sorts of things. That's fantastic. And if you can, that actually is a huge benefit of owning. And so if you can structure a creative deal, you may not need to have these two things. You can structure a creative deal directly with an owner, and if they're completely motivated, they may not ask you about your credit or your job history. But that also is the same for renting as well. If you call enough for rent signs, you'll eventually deal with a landlord that just needs to fill the property, and they don't really care about your application. But you got to make a bunch of phone calls, either way. And one more item on this owning list, and that is you could do a plex, a duplex, a triplex, a quad. So you can live in one of the units and then rent out the others. Once again, great idea in theory, but so few people end up doing it for a number of reasons. Number one, if you live in the property, you're also landlording. Sometimes you get too close to your tenants, and then when you get too attached to those tenants, too friendly with those tenants, They give you the sob stories. They don't pay the rent, but they have such a good excuse because they just had a car accident and all these things happen. And now all of a sudden you're paying a whole bunch of money. Maybe they throw parties next door from time to time. Maybe they're just weird and they bang on the walls sometimes. And so in theory, it sounds great to own a plex where you have your tenants in the same property and they're basically paying your rent. But in practice, very few people pull it off. But that's certainly another great idea for owning your own home versus simply renting, is that you can have somebody else pay your rent, if you will, by structuring it in that way. Now, you could also do one of these on a lease purchase, or I should say lease purchase or a master lease. You know, and you may want to lease all 4 units of a quad from an owner, and then you just sublease the other units and pay off the rent as well. You could do it that way. That's kind of a quasi between a renting and an owning. But you know, for me, again, I'm going back to my personal situation, and it depends on your situation. But you know, I have wife and kids. I mean, they're not going to want that. You know, they're going to want their own home with a white picket fence and all that kind of stuff. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed this video on whether you should own or rent your own home. I will go back to my original comment, which is for most people, renting is a really good idea over owning, because for all the reasons I've discussed. Owning can be more expensive, it can be more constrictive, because it's hard to get out of those things. And one more comment that I had somebody make to me, I almost forgot about this, on the side of owning, and it may be too far below that video for you to see it, and that is not making payments. Alright, so there is one more benefit to owning a home well over renting, potentially. I don't know if you call this a benefit or not. But if you don't pay your rent after a period of time, which depends on the sophistication of the landlord, but 30 to 60 to 90 days, you're out. They kick you out. If you own a home and you have a mortgage and you don't pay that mortgage, it can take that mortgage company 6 months, a year, 2 years. I've seen 6 years. I've seen it with my own eyes. 6 years to get somebody out of the property and kicked out. So, if you own a property, you have the benefit of potentially, if the world, you know, if everything hits the fan, that you could live there a little bit longer. You know, maybe another 6 months or a year longer. Now, there's still that huge level of uncertainty if you haven't made your payments, because maybe that foreclosing attorney gets his butt in gear and he forecloses a lot faster. But that is a slight edge right there. But that's not very sustainable. You know, I mean, you're going to be able to get away with that once. Then your credit will be destroyed. Or if you did a creative deal, hopefully you're able to get out of that deal and sell it or something. You don't want to destroy somebody else's credit. Whatever you can do to avoid that kind of thing. So it's not a sustainable concept, but it is actually true in the real world, is that if you don't make your mortgage payments, you can stick that out a lot longer than if you don't make your rent. Alright, so I still go back to, I think renting is better than owning for most people, but if you can get some massive equity, you have a long-term time horizon, you want permanence, and especially if you can get homesteaded, this can be a sweet angle. And also, if you got some equity in there, you can get a HELOC, and the HELOC can be used for you to invest in your businesses, your deals, and then that can be tax deductible if you don't use the standard deduction on your taxes, which most people do. So for that reason, that might be a moot point as well. All right, y'all, well, I'm Phil Pustiowski with freedommentor.com. You can learn so much more about what we teach at freedommentor.com, as well as just other videos in this YouTube channel. And for this specific subject, I love hearing comments and feedback, so please feel free to make comments below here. Maybe you completely disagree, maybe I missed a couple of items, because I wrote some good notes here, but there's so much to cover. I was trying to remember it all in my head as I shot this video. I may have forgotten a few things. So definitely make some comments below here on your attitude on what you believe to be the case, which is a better way to do it, owning or renting, as well as tell us a little bit about maybe your area in general. Maybe the cost of rent is $1,000 and you can buy a home for 20 grand. So obviously that's a much better deal to own than to rent. So anyways, I look forward to hearing your comments, both good, bad, ugly, and indifferent. And once again, thanks so much for watching this channel. Thanks for sticking it out with me with this long video, and I'll see you on the next video.